Let's get started, folks. We're almost on time. So this is the Plan 2035 Implementation Infrastructure Task Force meeting. Today's September 16th, 2024. And welcome back from our summer recess. And hopefully we will have a number of things to talk about today. And we reached out and asked folks for some future agenda item ideas. We got a lot of great ideas. So we're going to have to think about that and figure out the best way to organize those or how to get the most advantage out of them. So first on the agenda is a review. Do we have minutes to approve? They probably weren't distributed, were they? We met in June. Were they distributed in advance? I don't recall seeing them. Okay. All right, so we'll have those in this minutes meetings at our next meeting. Yeah. Very good. You might as well distribute them, yeah. If everybody feels comfortable, we can always approve them. I didn't. Okay, so we'll pass those out. In terms of progress on the task force and review the website and materials posted, we've had 4 meetings to date. Thank you. So we started with the Plan 2035 priority strategies and metrics, and Tony put together a very good PowerPoint back in March, and that covered a lot of ground. In April, we got bounced out of the room from a council meeting that ran long on the budget. So we moved that meeting to May 3rd. And we had a very lengthy PowerPoint presentation going over adequate public facilities, adequate public safety facilities and mitigation guidelines. But we also got into some other discussion on adequate facilities laws. Then on May 20th, we had an additional discussion around adequate public facilities. There was an overview PowerPoint, and I think we had a pretty deep discussion around a lot of those issues. And I think where we were is waiting for Park and Planning to come up with future ideas as to how to improve, what's working, what's not working. And I think Ron, speaking for a lot of people, doesn't think anything's working. Putting words in Ron's mouth, but I don't think he's going to object.
No, I
don't. And then we did APF on the Parkland Dedication Program and had more general discussion. One of the I saw a recommendation for an upcoming meeting that I looked at from a couple different ways, but it would be really good if we had a presentation. I'm not sure how this is going to get put together. I think it had to be a high level, but the depth of our infrastructure needs, this is part of what you mentioned, the funding needed to address it and the timeline in which you could accomplish it. I know they did some work on this a dozen years ago, and as I recall, just your basic park and planning project, DPWT projects was $500 million to $1 billion. Back in the day when I started on the council, school projects were $3 billion backlog, and then somehow it ballooned to $8 billion in backlog. And I know we've committed a couple billion in the last several years. So how many billion dollars backlog do we have in schools? I'm sure Park and Planning can get a number for us on their backlog. DOE, I think we shudder to think. The DOE.
I would just need more clarity on what you mean. Like, I think I need a clearer question than like, what is infrastructure? Like, do you want me to build sufficient great infrastructure to prevent flooding in all situations? Do you want me to build sufficient great infrastructure to uh, maintain existing residences? Do you want me to purchase land so that I can have green infrastructure to support these things? Like, what do you mean?
Well, I think that's the question that we need to come to an answer. And who's going to put this together? I mean, frankly, I would look to OMB and or finance, maybe central services, to come up with something. Because frankly, it's a little shocking that the county, as far as I know, does not have a document that's updated that says, here's what we're looking at for the future. I know in our budget discussions, in the non-D discussion, there's a list of how much we've spent on bonds over the last 15 years. And there's usually a projection of what we're going to be doing on debt service. And we've been projecting that we're going to be over our debt service limit, and we're pretty much there. But if you just look at the CIP, funded and unfunded projects beyond 6 years, and started adding them up, that would be a start. It wouldn't be, it wouldn't be anywhere near what the real number is. And a lot of those numbers are plugged numbers that have been plugged for years and years and years and have no reality. You know, something started at 8 million 15 years ago and it's still budgeted 8 million, while similar projects are being built for 20 million. But that's where, I mean, frankly, the county council ought to know this. The taxpayers ought to know this. You know, so in part, your suggestion, other people, that we look at infrastructure costs and do some budgeting. Well, number one, we need to do that on an annual basis in terms of here's how much money we have today and what are we going to spend it on. That's a topic we've talked about in the past that we need to talk about more. But what's the big number? You know, 20, 30 billion? And how much are we throwing at it every year? And, you know, I mean, when you think 20, 30 billion, is that realistic? Well, if we do have 6 to 8 billion in schools, we're probably getting up to $20 billion pretty quickly, Ms. Crooms.
I was just going to say that we do have funding under the climate action implementation strategies to start to try to put some some just like general, like, what is the breadth of this around this. So we do have some funding, and we do have a pathway to working with some consultants to get a better picture of that. And what we're looking at specifically is infrastructure resilience. What are the pieces of infrastructure that we are going to need to improve simply in light of the effects of climate change from an adaptation perspective? So I'm not talking mitigation. I'm just talking what needs to be protected and what needs to be done to sort of meet the need for largely water, right? Like, we're mainly thinking about water, but water, heat, and other electrical challenges, things like that. So that is something that we are going to start working on this year. We expect it to work on it over 2 years, though. It's not an easy ask, but it is something that we've already put into that strategy. So it is something that we're working through the process of how do we ask that question, and then how do we get an answer to that question that at least gives us a frame of reference. My always back of the napkin number, I'm probably not allowed to say this, but I'm going to say it anyways, 80 billion. I think 80 billion is what it would take to make this county resilient.
And that's resiliency. That doesn't address a lot of other needs.
Could I ask a question, Mr. Chair?
You may ask any question you want, Mr. Foreman.
Okay, well, thank you.
Hopefully on topic.
Well, yes, it would be on topic. I think this is a very interesting idea, all the infrastructure that is needed for Prince George's County. I think what may be also interesting for some of the older projects to see what has created some of the additional costs besides, let's just say, inflation, but materials, labor, additional environmental restrictions, those type of ideas, to get an understanding of what the policies the county is enacting may have had, or just general overall, living wages and all these things that are very good, but there is a cost that is associated to them, and usually it's passed on sometimes to these projects. So just kind of an idea of not just a total cost, but why is this project more expensive? Is it just inflation, or is there other things that kind of, contribute?
Fair enough, although I think if there's an increase in labor and costs and an increase in supplies, that's probably due to inflation. But you're really looking at regulatory costs.
Yeah, just to kind of get a better understanding as to kind of what role the government has in these additional costs.
You know, based on, I'm going to move off this in a second, but based on my limited knowledge, the county is not, what you're looking at doing, which to get you to a certain level of knowledge, is something that the county has not done in general. So we would be looking at a very high level number that has a huge fudge factor, but it would be better than nothing.
Right. I mean, I think that there isn't a lot of, so, I mean, we flow down those regulatory costs, right? So the regulation actually occurs at the federal or the state level, and then we write a manual to tell you how to do it, but we don't create regulatory costs. It's very difficult to kind of, I mean, my entire agency is a regulatory cost, right? So that's a challenge, but I definitely, I'm putting that in my notes as we're starting to have these conversations with our consultants that are going to help us start to figure this out, that identifying where some of these costs come from to see as we're going along if there are things that could be minimized, right? Because we also did the Resilience Authority study, which told us where like different aspects of the types of work and the ways that we're managing and focusing money does make things more efficient, right? Like if you're working with the private sector first, saying don't cut down the tree instead of planting the tree and the impact that has on the storm. There's a lot of different, so yeah, I'm definitely taking a note of it and seeing what pieces we can.
Thank you, Brad.
If it was easy, we would have done it already.
Yeah.
And just for everyone's benefit, it's probably for my benefit, staff has noted, it's on our agenda, but the webpage that we have for this task force is pretty robust. It's got all the minutes, it's got all the presentations, it's got video of all the meetings that we've had. So anybody who wants to go back if they missed something, or any of the public that wants to see what we've talked about, it's all right there. Staff is doing an excellent job keeping that up to date. So I got us off track a little bit just by talking about the next possible meeting, and there might be too soon to get a detailed, or not even detailed, a 30,000 foot level assessment of what our infrastructure needs are. So it might not be the next meeting. We can look at the other recommendations, or Ms. Hall might have some great ideas for us too. I'm sure she does. But let's move on. So the next item on the agenda is highlighting the current plans in progress that implement Plan 2035 and the climate action plans. I'll turn over to Ms. Hall. Director Hall.
Thank you so much, Chair Dernoga. Good afternoon. For the record, Lakeisha Hall, I'm the Planning Director for Prince George's County. So I'm happy to be here today to provide an update to this task force. I do want to acknowledge that there are two new members that have joined the task force today as well. That's from the Planning Department. And so greatly appreciate Tony Feltz and Katina Scholler here as well. And so in regards to this item, it's really important for us to level set, to talk about exactly what have we done, especially when we're starting to put forward funding and resources on our plans and strategies. And so I just counted very quick. We have over 29 plans and also initiatives that we're doing right now that's implementing Plan 2035. So what does that look like? So just to give you guys an idea of where we are, and we're more than happy to provide information to everyone. We have a map, and we also have a spreadsheet of what that's broken down. It was part of our conversation for budget FY25, so all of this is data that's already presented. So we have partnerships with municipalities, and so that's a very exciting program where we're working with our local municipalities. We have 27 incorporated areas. So as we are starting to move forward, Plan 2035, we have to have boots on the ground in the local areas. So we have a lot of projects that's currently being funded that's moving forward the Plan 2035 initiatives and policies. We have placemaking events. We had a very, very, very exciting placemaking event this past weekend where we're out in the community. We're trying to get feedback, boots on the ground, grassroots work with a lot of folks to get feedback as we're starting to move forward some of these items that we're working in Plan 2035. Sector and master plans. You guys are very familiar with that process. And then we also have sustainable communities initiatives. So as we're packaging together all these items as part of our FY25 efforts, our goal is to make sure that we're very intentional of what we're doing. And then as we're working on FY26 items, hopefully this task force can give us more direction in what we're doing right, what we're not doing right. I know that we did a presentation earlier this year looking at our indicators. So as we're looking at different topics to move forward, where are we doing poor performance? I think that's a great way for us to start to level set because we're pretty much 10 years into this process. And so we know where we're not doing well negatively, and then we also know we're neutral. So how do we start to pivot a little bit in a way that makes it very intentional of how we're moving forward some of these policy initiatives? So just to give you guys an idea, we know that we're neutral on fast food restaurants, mode split when it comes to multimodal transportation options. We're also looking at obesity and overweight issues as highlighted in our plan, recycling, greenhouse gas emissions. So how do we start to be intentional in the planning department as we're working together with great leaders like yourselves? So that gives you guys a very high overview of what we're funded this fiscal year that we're going to be very intentional moving forward. So Chair, that's my update on that item.
Any questions that we have? Mr. Tutman,
I'm curious, I don't know if we'll get a briefing at some point on county debt. I know in past years we've been refinancing with state guarantees. I'm just kind of wondering what's in the closet that might jump up and say boo at the point that we start actually making tangible plans about a sustainable county. Right? The debt burden for the county, as I understand, has been an issue in the past, right? Am I wrong?
I don't think debt burden's been an issue in the past. I think
Really?
debt burden's an issue now.
Okay. Fair enough.
I mentioned earlier, we get a briefing on the non-departmental budget that has what our debt service has been. I can pull it up and I can probably pull it up in 2 minutes.
Well, I know people run for public office on the basis of the bond rating, which is kind of like saying we have a real high limit on our credit cards, right? Isn't that kind of the same corollary? I mean, we're running on our ability to borrow rather than our ability to generate revenue and pay our bills.
Right, but yeah,
Dynamic.
we're one of the few counties in the country. There's 3,000 counties. A fair number of Maryland counties have AAA bond rating, but across the country, there's not that many counties that do. And we have a AAA bond rating, but to sustain that, because I think we got a warning notice this last go round. We have a 5% reserve required by charter, and Wall Street used to require a 2% reserve on top of that. Then it went to 3. I think it's gone to 4, and it might go to another 5, up to 5. It's still on top of the 5. So Wall Street's getting nervous. And when you look at our debt service limit by policy, we have set for many years an 8% of, revenue. Somebody help me. Sure. One second. But it's an 8% cap, of the general fund budget. And we've pretty much hit 8%. We've been toying with it. And as you look at other projects that are needed, there's been a lot of cuts the last couple of years and a lot of money shifted into the school system projects.
Yeah.
Like this year, we're not funding any. Let me rephrase that. We had like 2 or 3 firehouse rebuilds or major renovations or rebuilds. They've all been pushed from this year, next year being funded to being pushed outside the 6 years. We've got a number of police stations that need to be rebuilt. They're not funded. So in terms of debt service, we are up against it, and I can send out those figures. It's pretty simple. We get a nice briefing every year. I'll turn to my colleague, Councilmember Fisher. You have a question?
Yeah, I'm not a member of your task force. I just crashed your meeting. I hope that's okay.
We haven't objected yet.
Okay.
We'd love to have you. It's great.
Okay, I was like,
council
what's
member in
going
here.
on? I was leaving for my other thing, but I just had a question for you, Mr. Chair, about, I was chatting about Plan 2035, and when I worked on it when I was like a little baby staffer and all the success. Does this group talk about like how you're gonna show the public like this was what's in the plan, this was what we accomplished, like to the public, so they know like what was implemented? Because sometimes I think residents feel like they work on these plans and they don't see the fruition. And I think it's cool that there are some wins. I was just curious.
I'm going to turn to Director Hall. I think that's her role, or Park and Plan's role, and I think they're proud of the things that they've done.
And so, thank you, Councilwoman Fisher. So we do have benchmarks that we monitor, and so we do have a report that we came out with. Was it earlier this year? Like we look at what we're doing with our indicators. So we're like, where are we doing very well? Where are we doing neutral? And then where are we doing poorly? So we actually have a PowerPoint that shows based on the policies and initiatives, it probably came out right before I got here into this role in January. We're showing where we are with the policies, and then that helps us to decide when we're getting to the point where the plan is no longer working for us, then that's where we start shifting the narrative and what do we need to do to promote that in another plan, so to speak. So to your point, we do have those benchmarks that we've been monitoring, and we do have the information on our website. I'll let Tony talk about anything that he wants to share.
Yeah, so in 2019, we issued a 5-year update to look at where we were meeting the benchmarks. We're working on an update for that this year because we do it every 5 years. And then, as Director Hull mentioned, when this task force started, we prepared a PowerPoint that showed some of the benchmarks and where we were doing well, where we were doing not so well, and where we were doing well but not as well as we wanted to be. So there have been a few good wins as far as the metrics that we've been monitoring for Plan 2035.
And I think the council got briefed on this early last year, definitely, and maybe early this year. And Plan 2030, the very first thing that we did on this task force was get a briefing, and Tony did the PowerPoint. So that was our March 18th meeting, our very first March 18th. Yes, yes. So then now, in terms of taking it to the public, not directly. Let me turn to Mr. Weiss.
To follow on Councilmember Fisher's question, I encourage the planning staff to bring your message to the communities. You know, we're the ones, in my view, we're the ones that are feeling the effects of plans and implementation of plans. And I think most people, I think I can say this safely, is most people haven't a clue about that. And I think both the public and the planning people would benefit from a conversation between the public and you. Thank you.
And so I definitely appreciate that feedback. And so one thing we can do is publicize more our Plan 2035 website. And so we have all that materials online, but to your point, we need to use our social media, our constant contact, really start to blast. One thing I feel very proud about, we're doing a brown bag series. And so we're starting to open up the doors of our office once a month where we're educating the public and the community free of charge about different things that we're talking about. We also have the Neighborhood Planning Academy where we talk about this as well. But to your point, we have a large county and we're trying to get the message out as much as possible. But we greatly appreciate that.
If I could, Mr. Chair, I also
please.
did want to mention one other item that we're doing this year. We're reviewing RFP submittals now, but the master plan evaluation project, as you know, the county has about 37 master and sector plans, which all are designed to complement Plan 2035 in some way. And this RFP that we've just put out is going to issue report cards on each one of those 37 master and sector plans, as well as a full database of all the recommendations of all the plans, so that we can better be able to analyze the data that we have coming up and see how good we're doing on our progress for each of those plans. And what we hope is that this will be able to better inform our 6-year work program, so we can better identify needs within the county where a sector or master plan may not be working as well as it should, and be able to better identify where we can update those plans.
Good, and I'm sure Subregion 1 will be listed at the top as needing to be replaced.
We are definitely going to look at sub-region. Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Okay, so, Ms. Director Kerms.
If we're done with Councilmember Fisher's question, okay. Then I wanted to go back to Mr. Tutman's question just really quickly, just to raise the other issue of the, that we have two funds, right? Two particular We have the solid waste fund, and we have three funds. I guess we have the solid waste fund, we have the stormwater fund, and we have the water quality fund. All three of which the executive branch noted in this last session of budget are broke. Or at least cannot meet the need as they are, right? And we've asked for an evaluation of how we're going to increase the revenue in those, because when you look at the regulatory responsibilities and the fact that these funds are used for a substantial portion of what we consider infrastructure, right? I don't do roads, I don't have to deal with money from roads coming from that, but I mean, all of our clean water infrastructure, all of our flooding infrastructure, the new street sweeping infrastructure, all of those things, are coming from that. And then we've got solid waste, which is building the landfill and our major facilities that do that. And so, I mean, we are very aware that within those funds, which are a little bit separate from the general fund, and my understanding of how the bond rating, socialist, not good at money, but like that, there's a real problem there with what's coming in, what's going out, and the amount that we're spending on debt service versus the amount that we're able to spend on new projects, right? So we have to borrow the money, whether it's through the SRF process or through the bonding process to build these CIP projects, because obviously there's just not enough time to save the money. Environmental racism, environmental justice problems don't have the money, didn't have the infrastructure, things cost a lot of money. But yeah, I mean, we are at kind of a critical point because the regulatory expectations and then the county's desires don't fit in with this, right? Like, I'm able to do the baseline at this point to meet regulatory obligations, but I can't really build infrastructure of the depth and breadth needed because both of those funds are in a challenging situation.
But I also thought the pension plan for the county was in various times in trouble in the past years. Have we fixed that problem? It was underwater up to like 10 years ago. I mean, like insolvent. Right.
My impression is it's in better shape than it was. It was in bad shape a number of years ago. I think I could be wrong on this part, but I think under the Baker administration, they made some adjustments with regard to county employee unions to make it a little more affordable. And the chair of the council sits on the trustee board, and I can assure you, as someone who did that last year, and even though I have a background in pensions, I'm not going to pretend I understood everything that was going on. So I'm not sure how much council chairs add to the equation, but my impression that I took away was that we're in much better shape than we had been. So, always a concern. I know government, frankly, private and government pension plans across the country have been in bad shape, particularly after the fiscal crisis, but they weren't in that greatest shape before that. But with the stock market run up and everything's invested, funds have done pretty well.
I hate to be the rain cloud. I just want to make sure we have an unvarnished look at real numbers, real realities. That's all.
We believe in unvarnished. Okay, let's move on to our next and last substantive topic, highlighting legislation implements Plan 2035 for FY25. Oh, is it really FY25? It's really got to be council legislative year.
I guess it would be calendar year. That's correct, sir. Or maybe the legislative year.
Technically legislative year, and then we got the state legislative year because who knows what they're going to do.
Exactly, that's correct. So once again, Lakeisha Hall for the record. So right now we have 3 legislation that's of interest for this task force. And so we have EV charging and parking. And so that legislation is currently going through the process before council. The second one is the woodlands legislation. So I will be remiss if I didn't mention that we are also getting an award for our woodlands legislation. And so very exciting because basically folks that are in the planning circles are really excited with the work that we're doing here. And so which conference is that, or which Maryland APA chapter, they're going to offer us an award next month with the legislation that was adopted by council right before recess. But we have a part 2 where we're going and we're starting to refine and streamline a little bit more the legislation. And so that's going before the TIEE committee this Thursday, next Thursday. And so that's something that's it's helping to refine the legislation that you guys are aware of at this time. And then we have, as you guys know, the zoning code rewrite, which is something that has implications of how we're looking at implementing our policies. And so as part of that process as well, there's certain things that Plan 2035 wanted our code rewrite to capture. And so that bill, that very big omnibus bill, has some of those components in it. So that's the quick update, sir, that I wanted to provide on legislation. Depending on what kind of session or calendar year that you're looking at, that's what we currently have in our books. Yes.
Mr. Hurd.
Yes, I was just wondering if you wanted to offer any predictions about what might, well, two questions. One, did Park and Planning have any recommendations that they had planned to make to the state as far as state legislative reforms? And two, were there other things that you predict might come up, whether you recommended them or not?
So the great thing, I had the pleasure of going to Mako this year, and so there's some topics that are impacting a lot of governments across the state at this time. And so I know for sure ADUs are going to be a big item, and so that's been very vocalized across the state. The other thing that we've been keeping track of are solar panels. And how does that impact us in Prince George's County? So I know at a minimum those two items will be discussions that may go into the session that will impact us here locally. We haven't been working on any legislation, but I will be remiss if I didn't mention that we're doing a missing middle housing study that's going to help us to start looking at the different housing typologies, and ADUs are one of the housing typologies. Accessory, what is it called? An accessory or accessory dwelling units. And so for those that are not familiar, those are the granny flats. The state is looking at ADUs even as basement type of units, units that are in multi-story buildings. And so there's different ways that that's going to be discussed at the state level. And so that's something that we're keeping our eye on. I don't have any predictions. I'm not a betting woman. So I'm hoping that we don't have a lot of things that follow up from the density bill that we saw that also was adopted by the governor in the last session.
In terms of the topic, I was hoping we were going to talk about FY25 or calendar year, legislative year 25, for things that might be on the upcoming agenda. So I don't know, are you looking at any county legislation for next year?
So one thing that I know that we're preparing for this fiscal year is in regards to our subdivision regulations. We have gotten a lot of feedback from multiple stakeholders, residents, a lot of folks in the county that really wants to make sure that we have the best legislation when it comes to subdivision. So as part of our Brown Bag series, we're getting feedback through that mechanism as well. So we're going to have 3 more sessions before the end of the year to get input of what that looks like. And so we feel very comfortable once we do get a good feel of what that looks like, then we'll bring that before this committee and this task force for consideration. Let's see, I think that's the most pressing thing that I'm aware of at this time. There are some bills that are still working their way out that's not tied to this task force, but that's the only one that I can speak of at this time is the subdivision regulations.
Yeah, speaking of which, there's a subdivision bill also in play right now for exempting data centers from subdivision, which could get interesting.
Yeah, and so we wanted just to highlight of what's implementing Plan 2035. That's the update that I was trying to provide, not going into some of those other legislations that are pending at this time.
I'm not sure how the data center bill works to implement Plan 2035. Exempting subdivision. We'll see. Well, looking forward to next year, I put together a list. Not that these are all going to happen, but things that have been kicking around for several years. They were in probably in Plan 2035 in some fashion, and were put into the Climate Action Plan. Before I get to that, as I mentioned before, it's our understanding from our prior meetings that Park and Planning is looking at updating APF ordinances. So I'm not sure. The last we heard, I think you were hiring consultants to look at it. I assume that's kind of where we're still at.
Yes, sir. And so we want to make sure we have that fiscal impact study in place. One thing I do want to highlight is that legislation that will be forthcoming is for the master plan of transportation. It's been 15 years since we've updated our transportation countywide plan. And so the good thing is that Montgomery County, they're working on theirs. And so we've been in conversations with them recently. And so that legislation is not going to be adopted in the fiscal year, but it will start moving forward as part of a draft document in the first quarter of next year. So we're looking at different ways to look forward with APFO. I would be remiss. I don't see it coming forward in FY25 because we're still working through the fiscal impact study components.
Want to join us? It's drop-in day for council members. Bring your council member to work day. Welcome, Mr. Hawkins. Pleasure to have you with us. One of the items that's been in the climate action plan that I would love to see get implemented through legislation is park and planning working with DOE to come up with a climate score for individual development projects to measure conformity with the climate action plan. That's a task that's in the climate action plan, and it seems to make sense. Now, I'm sure we get a lot of arguing. I'm sure Mr. Foreman, he's already texting the MBIA to let them know. But if we're going to be serious about the climate action plan, we need to start looking at individual projects and assessing. Now, what comes of that is another question. Is it another test where it's like the school adequacy test? We have a test, and if you fail, you pass. It's true. And something that I think I've talked about with perhaps you, Director Hall, but I know I'm sure with Mr. Feltz in previous presentations to the council, a CIP review team. I thought you were working on legislation or a policy where park and planning and the relevant budget agencies sit down and prioritize how we're going to spend CIP money. I mean, that's been in Plan 2035. When you look at the CIP budget that comes out, there's no indication that that's occurring. And it seems like we might need legislation to make this more formalized.
So I do want to share, and thank you, Ms. Scholler, for sharing that. There was a report that was provided, but I think as a follow-up to your question, it's like, what does that legislation look like? And so it's just looking at commission and also county CIP efforts because, you know, the CIP efforts cross multiple agencies. So I think to your point, how do we pull that together as part of a very intentional effort? So I'm not sure what that timeline looks like as well and what exactly with the county and the commission CIP efforts, how do we start to align that? Because, you know, there's the funding piece, there's other public-private partnerships. And so that's something that we're also being very mindful of is what exactly can we do with our private sector so that we're not feeling the pinch on public dollars. And that's part of the assessment that we're looking at.
Right. So in the climate action plan, there's a statement that this is a sort of a task, but then under the steps, there's enumerated steps. And the one that's most relevant is for the County Executive Council to identify a CIP review team, OMB, Park and Planning, EDC, audits, investigations, and annually review the CIP program during budget preparation to ensure consistency with the Climate Action Plan and Plan 2035. Now, that's, as a matter of fact, that was in Plan 2035 land use recommendation 1.5. So this has been around for 10 years. Nothing's moved on it. It's been in the climate action plan for the last 2 years. So what I'm taking away from this is the council probably needs to look at legislation creating this team and making this something. Now, is it going to be every project has to get a score to get funded? You know, there are things that need to be funded that are not at the top of the Plan 2035 list. But I don't think we're being as intentional as we need to be in focusing on transit development CIP projects. If we go back to the credit card problem that Mr. Um, Tutman has raised, our credit card doesn't let us do all the things that we need to do. And as we prioritize, it's going to make it difficult in places where we want to address shortfalls, but they're not priority items. Yes, Director Crooms.
Just a brief comment on that. Well, first, I do want to reiterate that there is no climate action plan. There's a draft climate action plan. There is a climate implementation action plan that is on, that we have developed about how we achieve these things. And that we did evaluate that as one, I don't remember which chapter it's in, because we've got got a number of chapters done and then some chapters that we're still working on, but we identified some sort of pre-steps that need to happen before we can get there. So I would just kind of point back to when we got all the agencies together and a representative from council and sat down and figured out how do we actually do this. There's a whole bunch of things that add up to us getting to the point of being able to do that prioritization. We've implemented sort of some band-aids until we can get those foundational pieces built. One of those was adding to, when we do the analysis of like proud priorities and things like that, we added climate as one of them. So we asked agencies to start to evaluate whether their project added to resiliency or reduced resiliency, right? Whether their project met one of the key objectives of climate goals. So there are some, and I can't off the top of my head tell you what they are, but we had some foundational things that needed to be done before we would be able to really look at the CIP as a whole in that way, because there were other foundational things that were missing.
Right. So the climate action plan has the word draft in front of it, but some of us think it's not really a draft. The only reason it's in draft stage is because the council was going to adopt it as a final plan, but the administration asked us to hold off while you did your magic. But time's passed. I'm not sure that anything's going to change, but I think the policies that are in the plan, generally speaking, are pretty good, and we need to be starting to implement them. But this particular item that I mentioned is 10 years old from Plan 2035, so it's not like it's just the plan. The climate action plan just came up with this. Just looking at the other ones. One that's been yes.
Quick question. So when we talk about priority lists, things that might be outside the realm of the county, have we submitted to the state for support?
So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by priority list. Could you provide a little bit clarification on
Well,
that?
they was talking about priority lists, and he had mentioned climate control, but maybe some other projects that maybe the county can't fulfill. Have we reached out to the state to find funding or assistance in the projects that you might have?
I'm talking about county projects. Whether whether it's new schools, rebuilding schools, road projects, fire stations. We have, as we talked about, limited money and billions of dollars in needs. So how do we decide? Right now, I think it's decided. I'll say politically. I don't mean that in a bad way. There are reasons why things need to be done in certain locations, but there's a level of true politics that gets in the way. And with Plan 2035 said, let's focus our money, not all the money, but focus our money on downtowns and create places, and let's focus it on other transit development. So that's the prioritization. So the question becomes, as we see the budget every year, there's nothing that says, oh, here's our climate score, or these are things we need to do because they conform to Plan 2035. Now, in terms of reaching out to the state, I would say Director Crooms and DPWT have reached out to the feds for all kinds of support.
Our total budget for FY25 infrastructure projects, about 25% of that at this point is either state or federal money.
that help? Another item from the climate action plan. This is, I think, this is a reporting issue where the administration provides an annual report detailing financial subsidies by type provided to development projects. So where are we prioritizing our funding that we hand out, whether it's TIFs, housing department funding? That was an issue going back 3-4 years ago where we were supporting senior housing or affordable housing projects, and we were supporting them out in like Upper Marlboro or down in Clinton in non-transit serviceable locations. It's like good project, but this is really where you want to put the limited funds that you have. So once again, that's a Plan 2035 action item, or at least a climate action plan action item. And the last one that I mentioned, which could be useful legislation since we're talking subdivision. This just says revise the subdivision regulations, require older projects to be reevaluated to ensure public infrastructure will be considered and updated, and whether it's adequate. This is an age-old issue. And this is where I learned from Mr. Foreman. I'm not as familiar with the new subdivision regs, or I'm not as familiar with as I am with the zoning regs.
Now, this has been my review. I will ask Park and Planning staff if I get it wrong to please correct me. One of the major issues with the new subdivision regulations was the untethering in some ways of your actual lot lines in a preliminary plan from your finding of adequacy. So that every project that goes forward, actually every project that was existing as of April 1st, 2022, was granted a certificate of adequacy that was valid for 12 years. Any new project that goes forward has it gets a certificate of adequacy. It's almost like a sister application that goes along with a preliminary plan. And if you go to final plat, you go to construction, your adequacy doesn't vest until you have a certain level of final plats recorded if it's a larger project and a certain amount of construction. Except in other extraordinary situations where when maybe one of your conditions was you had to do $2 million worth of roadway improvements, well, it would be kind of unfair after 12 years and you spent $2 million just on roadway improvements that you were found, to lapse adequacy. But yeah, that is for every project that gets approved, you get 12 years with 1 6-year extension, depending on other circumstances, for a project to be adequate. So you can build the lot lines in there, but you don't necessarily have adequacy.
Got it. And what I would suggest is for the listening public, 12 years plus 6-year extension sounds like there's no limit. I mean, because residents have been complaining about never-ending adequacy, and if I can understand from the business industry standpoint, 12 plus 6 is not long enough. And from the public standpoint, 6 years is probably more than enough.
But this is also when it covers larger multi-phase projects. Generally, that's there isn't. Yeah.
Understood. Not all projects are created equal, but this is, I think, something that I'll state the obvious. If you do a town hall meeting with residents around the county, adequate public facilities is probably the number one issue, and they don't think the county system works. They don't think Park and Planning does its job. They don't think the county council does its job, and we can show all the metrics we want, but the public is dissatisfied. And it starts with adequate facilities, and it starts with probably transportation number one, and probably schools number two, and for a lot of folks, various flooding issues would be high up on the list. So this is the push and pull of what we deal with.
Yeah, and when it goes from unlimited adequacy to now there is a limit, I think that, and this was through the multi-year process, because I was involved in a lot of these meetings and discussions with the consultants, with Park and Planning staff, with experts about there isn't there was a perceived issue, because I'm not going to go on record saying there was an issue, that once you recorded your final plats, that was adequacy that was vested forever. And they would hold up other projects or it would be concern other issues. So the development community did work, as I said, to negotiate about what is a reasonable amount of time to have a project, because these are important projects. They will last a while. You want it, but sometimes you do need to get to a final plat, get to a certain amount of construction does take a good amount of time. And that's assuming you can even get financing right after you get approval. So you may not get financing 5 years, 6 years into your adequacy. Because that's also if you have to go through a detailed site plan, and we all know how long that can ask. So, looks like Director Holwitz like that.
And if I can just chime in, and so I think the other part of the conversation that we're seeing as we're updating our plans is that we have a lot of commuter traffic coming through our county. And so some of those things we cannot mitigate. And so because there's successes that's happening around our county, we have cross-through traffic that's putting a big strain on our resources. So how do we as leaders, as visionaries, also deal with that? And so we're learning that through our master plan of transportation, that one county in particular, 35% of their residents is commuting within our county for employment job centers. So how are we starting to look at that as part of the larger conversation? Because that's a big ask for us to be able to deal with that infrastructure improvement on our dime.
I would comment when I first stumbled into doing land use in the 1980s, this issue existed. And what the Park and Planning Commission and the county council said back then was, all this traffic is coming through our county, so if we put on adequacy, transportation adequacy that's too tough, they'll get all the development we won't. So basically, we'll just not deal with it. And I've heard that in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. And, so yes, it's a problem, but we don't have any, 40 years on, I've not seen a solution other than just deal with it. And unfortunately, our constituents are tired of dealing with it. Now, I got my own opinion, which is not worth anything, which is we shouldn't let far-flung counties have whatever land use, rights they want. We end up with this checkerboard. This is true all over the country. It's our county's got an urban area and a rural area, and the next county has an urban area up in a rural area, and it's just this checkerboard. It's not how they do it in Europe, and of course, not everything's great in Europe, but there are urban boundaries for every city, every village, and they have less land to work with, and they're very careful about retaining their agricultural land, and they're more careful about suburban sprawl. But that is that. Oh, I'm done. Real quick, so I think we're finishing up. Mr. Simmons, you came a little late. I was talking early on about some of the ideas we have for upcoming meetings, and I saw you had a recommendation we do something on workforce development in terms of infrastructure. Now, I'm not sure it's the kind of infrastructure we're used to dealing with, but I understand your point. It is a necessity. So just real quick, do you have some thoughts on what kind of presentation you might want or discussion?
I think as we talk, it came up one of the meetings I attended a while ago. I think as we, capitalize on opportunity, and when we talk about infrastructure, because everybody talks about budget, there's billions of dollars of funding going towards infrastructure projects. A lot of it from the federal government is now intertwined with workforce development and projects that we saw, the tunnel in Baltimore. So part of the ability for us to capitalize to fund projects and do that is going to be that workforce component, because now it's a mandatory requirement on some of the DOT EPA funding. And so that's why I was bringing it up. There's also some project that we've talked about. And in our conversations, even with some of the projects with Mayor and State Authority, we notified them that this project qualified for funding. There's also some, we've talked with Clean Water Partnership. We've talked with a couple other pieces about working on flooding. That also qualifies as a project where we can get funding. So there's an opportunity there to fix some of the infrastructure issues, raise additional dollars to support county projects if we include those components. I also sent council members on Wednesday. We also are releasing the state of the workforce report, 150-page report related to workforce development. We're required as one of the 13 workforce areas in Maryland to write a 4-year local federal plan with our workforce dollars. This report goes into that plan. That plan is due next year, so this report normally comes out about a few months before we have to start writing that plan. And just really some key points that aren't necessarily intertwined in this. That's why normally we sit on the edge and our quiet group. But some things we hear really jump out. So like you were just talking about commuting patterns, and to kind of go along with that, this report is released on Wednesday. Just to give you an idea, approximately 76% of working residents commute to work outside of Prince George's County. Conversely, over 65% of jobs in Prince George's County are filled by people without that. So when you talk about you're talking about your 75% of your labor force, you're talking about an outward bound of 289,000 some odd people. So just some of these things that y'all are discussing are inside of our kind of workforce scope, especially when you talk about net commuting base and where we compare, because somebody mentioned the surrounding counties on commuting and infrastructure. So just wanted to highlight some of those pieces. And the council members, each council member will get this report. And we've invited all the government elected officials, including task force members, Wednesday from 11:30 to 1 at 1801 McCormick Drive. A national labor economist, Dr. Christopher Laney, will be presenting this report to elected and government officials. If you can't reach that, from 2 to 4 p.m., we'll have a community stakeholder session that day. And then after that, we have limited copies, but it'll be posted on our website. But some of these are, we're really looking at a lot of these projects and reaching out to contractors to make sure we can access those additional funds as a workforce component, and then as it relates to other projects, given that information.
Do you think you might do like a 20 or 30-minute presentation to the task force next meeting or the meeting after?
Sure.
We can come up with a schedule. I think that'd be a useful summary, whether it's on that report or broader topics, but I'm sure the report would be the highlight.
Sure.
That would be great.
Yeah, if I can, I'll let Mr. Weiss go.
Mr. Weiss?
You know, I live near Indian Head Highway. We get 80,000 vehicles a day. I think a lot of that traffic is because we don't have the jobs where we live that will pay enough to afford to live where we live. And the people who work where we live can't afford to live where I live. So we've got a mismatch between jobs and where people live that causes an infrastructure burden that we have to accommodate some way or another. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot by not encouraging smart development where people live. And this is a hot topic for me that people have to drive for over an hour to get to a job. And it's getting worse as more residents are built south of us and increase the traffic flow. Thank you.
Mr. Foreman?
Yes, thank you. We'll start by saying I agree with Mr. Weiss that we should get rid of single-family zones. I think that's what he got there, so that way you have more density around jobs. But really, what my question was for Mr. Simmons, when you say workforce development, and I'm sorry, is that about just jobs and careers in the county, or is that getting younger people into jobs and careers? Because I usually think of workforce development as, training people, but it sounds like it's more just like getting a workforce.
Yeah, when we're looking at it, I mean, training people would be a workforce development service or activity. When we're talking about workforce development, we're talking about labor force. We're talking about supply and demand. We're talking about commuting patterns. We're talking about everything you listed. Do we have the jobs in the area that matches our residents? Do our residents have the skills and qualifications that match the jobs in the area? You also have your economic development plans. Are we attracting? Do we have the talent for the businesses that we're trying to attract? Do we have the talent for the business we're trying to retain? One of the things, like recently, they just opened the Laurel Multi-Service Center last week in Councilmember Dernoga's district. we actually invested funding to put a job and resource lab inside of that center to really identify some gaps of people trying to commute outward. But also, we're growing a lot of businesses in that area. We should have a job center that works in tandem with the economic development effort. So we're trying to integrate this. When we look at it, we look from that microscope. A training is an activity or microcosm to meet some of the key economic indicators in there. But we're looking at that. When you talk about jobs, we do look at two indicators. One is QCEW, which is the quarterly census of employment and wages, which relates to infrastructure, because that's the number of employed people in your county, regardless of where they live. And I think one of the key points that I think we should look at in future conversations, historically, when you talk about ICSC, you talk about Conference USA, and we give that jobs number, that is a QCEW number. So sometimes we might actually be promoting some of the barriers that y'all are talking about based on the jobs number that we're looking at, right? And so when you look at some of these projects, that is going to bring an influx of outward bound commuters into the county, which directly relates to that. But we also talk about LAUS jobs numbers, which is local area unemployment statistics. And that is the number of unemployed or employed Prince George's County residents. And so we're looking at both. And part of that is looking at CTE completers, the college universities, credential attainment, and are we matching and preparing our young people and adults and transitioning adults for the careers that are here, which puts a lesser stress on what we're talking about, has additional economic gains, and that's a part about planning and strategic investment. So it's a little bit of both. We're looking at the QCEW, quarterly census of employment and wages, but also LAUS, local area unemployment statistics. So a lot of times when we're asking and talking with different people about jobs numbers, we're clarifying what jobs numbers they're looking at, and we're talking about planning. But I do think we do have to take a look, and we talk about the future planning of Prince George's County. If we aren't preparing from our educational system people for the jobs in the now and the intermediate future, 30 years from now, there's going to be a new group of people sitting here talking about the same thing. And so we really have to talk about what jobs are we attracting, how do we retain, and are we creating an environment where they live? Now, the good news is this plan also notates that we have had a decrease in the rate of travel of Prince George's County residents for work. We have a decrease in that, and they're traveling in a shorter distance. How we attribute that to what economic factors we have to figure out. And we also have to think about the future of this county when we talk about infrastructure, is that we have a huge population of immigrant population, and the immigrant population, foreign-born population, actually has a different targeted working sector and a lower educational attainment, which will also change planning, access, and infrastructure. And so those are things we talk about when we look at these. And so training is the kind of the smaller piece of that. From these type reports, we're really trying to engage. We work with the EDC. We work with parking planning as well and different elements of it, right? And we've had some meetings in the years past. And it's just our contributing factor to the greater conversation. But some of the investments that we're seeing with the Job Center in Laurel, we have American Job Center, National Harbor. Like, to give you an idea, in your area, we built American Job Center, National Harbor inside of Tanger Outlets. We also, and part of what we've been trying to do there's a slow traffic flow, right? But we're also trying to get more of our service provider community to offer services down there and not force residents who could have the opportunities, but they can't get opportunities because they don't have access to the education or services, because we put a subset of our county services on the opposite side of the county, which then limits the economic success or it limits the future success. So some of these things are things that we're looking at to drive that. And that goes into the factor, but we can present that 20 or 30 minutes. And again, I think it's not directly connected, loosely connected, but some of these things with the economic development, parking plan, and economic development cluster, we're just trying to make sure that the workforce component isn't left out of that economic development, and where there are synergies to improve the county and plan for the future, we want to make sure that we're doing that. We also are really looking at the location of our educational programming in relation to the jobs, because in some of our educational opportunities, the immediate training, and when you're talking about the residents in those schools, are getting trained for industries that may or may not be regional. And so we also have to talk about our talent pipeline leaks, and are we pushing our residents out and attracting non-residents in, which in some of the statistical areas we actually are. And it's because we haven't done some of that educational and economic planning inside of that infrastructure planning. And so we're just trying to highlight some of these deficits and make sure that we want to make sure that we're providing the necessary data to create that inclusive strategy. But you're right, it is a non-traditional. We were just trying to insert it in there, council member. But we just want to figure out how to be that resource.
You're doing a great job of inserting it. Good stuff. Good stuff. We're pretty much at the end of the meeting. Is there any additional items anybody wants to discuss or raise? Guess we have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay, any discussions? Seeing none, we are adjourned. And Randa, what's our next meeting date? You're not sure?
You already sent it up.
The meeting for the invitation for the October meeting was already sent, but I'm gonna send a reminder a week after, before the meeting
Do you have the date?
takes place. It's October 18th.
What's that?
Oh, apologies. October the 12th. Oh God. I don't have it here.
I think it's gonna be the 7th or the 14th. No, the 14th is a holiday. 21st. I got October 21st on my calendar. Okay, unless I get corrected, it's October 21st at 3:30. Thank you, everybody.